this come to be, man?
Word monster come to mind. One minute you're a person like you are, the next minute you're not.
I know you're tired of this monster.
Do you want to see him? Device in hand, round.
Did the monster seek them out?
Yes and no. One minute I'm fine, the next minute I'm honey-watered.
It has happened again, still again. A woman has been found murdered in one of the most painful forms of murder.
Detectives say they found the nude body of a 43-year-old woman. The victim has been identified as Donna Bennett Johnston of Baton Rouge. The cause of death? Strangulation.
Sean Gillis is Baton Rouge's latest suspected serial killer. The most recent homicide, 43-year-old Donna Bennett Johnston.
How did you encounter Donna?
I encountered Donna on my first, shall we say, really successful hunt, capture, and kill. I left with the intent to find a woman and do her mortal harm. When I had the urge, it was all. Something in me had to be satiated. It was early Thursday morning. I encountered her near Geronimo Street. I picked her up. We began talking. I noticed she was very drunk. We went off in search of a secluded area where the deed could be done. And by the deed, I mean killing her. Now, she was still ostensibly thinking we were going off to have sex.
It's interesting that Gillis had a live-in partner and fulfilled the role of step-parent. We do see this sometimes with individuals who are psychopathic. They live a public life that appears on paper to look like everybody else. Gillis wants to blend in, which is part of how I think he lured his victims in.
She just fell asleep. I mean, we're talking sleep, deep sleep. For a minute, I was thinking, maybe this is gonna be a lot easier than I thought. I didn't even need to stealthily get the tie wrap. I just casually picked it up, stuck it on her head, pulled her head forward, dropped it on her, still didn't wake up. Then, she woke up. She's, I can't breathe. And, I just told her that's the plan,
She's not even really able to fight back. I think that's where you see a streak of sadism in him, that even in this very focused kill that was quick by his own description, he still needed that moment for her to plead, to beg. I think that it was a necessary first step to start the process of the arousal for him.
At this point, I wanted some pictures. Popped open the trunk. Got a few good pictures. Just many poses, her legs hanging out the trunk, her top torso hanging out the trunk, both, with her body curved into the trunk. Artistic say removed her completely from the trunk and laid her face down, trying to react to other forensic scenes I'd seen, as if I were a crime scene photographer. Click, click, rolled her over, positioned her in another way. Click, click.
What was that fascination about?
You could do things with a dead woman you couldn't even dream of doing with a live woman. It's yours to do with as you wished. I had the machete. I wanted to get a hold on. I got the hand. and it was pretty much time to get out of here.
His willingness to act this out and make his arms go limp and demonstrate what a dead body might look like hanging out of a trunk. It just moves, the theatrical dimension of his behavior forward. And also gives you some clue as to the kind of fantasies that he has. Have complete control over the body as if it were a doll or an object is apparently amusing to him.
The photography allowed him to have a token to take with him to relive the crime. And the purpose of reliving the crime when someone is a sexual sadist is to recreate that arousal sexually for themselves. Those days when he felt bored or flat or disengaged, which is very common for psychopaths, those photographs fill that void.
When we see a crime scene, we look at it, we'll say, what's the degree of fantasy here?
And where was I between Hitchcock and Disney?
Tell me, what's your mom like?
Wonderful. She was married when she had me. Dad left town about a year or two after I was born. And so she had to both be the nurturer and the disciplinarian. We're Roman Catholics.
As I am.
Okay, then you understand the guilt. Sex was dirty. One time, this is cute. I did touch my mother's breast when I was starting 9, 10, 11, 12 in that area. I just, for the fun of it, just, but even when I was littler, I knew what I was doing. I mean, I could nuzzle her. Her friends had come over and they're, oh, how cute. Look at him, he's so cute. And I'm just rubbing my face in there. Yeah, if you only knew.
Did you ever think about having sex with her?
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm sorry, any boy that tells you they didn't is lying to you.
He was suggesting to the profiler that this is every boy's fantasy. Now, is it really? I think he is mistaken, but it lets you know from an early age that there was something wrong with him.
When you're dealing with someone who's this psychopathic, you have to take a lot of what they're saying with a grain of salt. Because a very cliche, stereotypical belief a lot of criminals have is that psychologists have this anchored belief that boys want to have sex with their moms. So this is really him playing to the profiler. He wants to be studied. Okay, come study me. I'm such an interesting, complex person. So he's giving her what he thinks she wants to hear.
If she were to pass away, it would have been a while before I would have called the authorities to let them know there was a dead body in the house.
What would you have done with her?
She would have been a life-size Barbie doll. There would have been a lot of playing.
Like what?
Posing, changing the clothes, putting her in something sexy, role-playing, I guess, like you would do with a doll.
He compared her to a Barbie doll, something lifeless, nonetheless arousing for him. The average person would find this grotesque. He likes it better if they're dead, because therefore there's no conversation, there's no being challenged on his motives or his desires, and therefore he can revel in his perverse fantasies.
This gives us a window into where Gillis's fantasies may have begun. He had to plot and correct and reform and restage the fantasy in his mind before he actually went out and started hunting real live women.
Tell me an approximate number.
4, 5, 6, 7. Honestly, there so easily could have been so many more. When my utter contempt for society in general began, it became a slow desire to annihilate They weren't human. I've seen Hardy dozens of times, jogging down Perkins Road and stuff. I guess you could call it stalking after a while. I mean, she was cute. Certainly on that day, I knew she was coming by. There was just something about the bounce of her hair or something. I was in that zone now.
So there's that hunting behavior, getting to know his specimen, his kill. Being in the zone is really that high. Once he gets locked and loaded on the idea that he's gonna go kill again and torture, he's ready to go do it.
I turned and then just gunned it. I swiped her and she flipped over in the ditch. I mean, it wasn't like, my God, I hit a woman, I'm coming to check on her. It's like, my God, I started it, I've got to finish it. As she was getting up, I was out the car and on top of her.
You already had the object in your hand you was going to use to pull it.
That was a large nylon tie wrap device. You got like maybe 30 seconds to 45 seconds before you just gone. Now, obviously, there was some sick pleasure in my brain, but I derived no pleasure.
Well, then, who took the pleasure? What is he blaming, his brain and not himself? So that's where you see he's being disingenuous. It comes across as baloney.
He's splitting off parts of himself. There's the monster, there's the brain, and these things are different than Gillis. That's what he's essentially saying to us. It's not true. We understand it's all part and parcel of himself as one collective person who's doing these acts. But I think there's a part of him that does struggle to understand his own fantasies.
I checked her out, touched her. I was going to have sex with her, but I couldn't. Miss Schmidt, I did bring into the house. I sat her up on one of the wooden chairs with her arms behind it, and she was just sitting there.
Did you cut Hardy in any way?
I had marked her to make cuts with a red Sharpie, like a butcher would mark a cut of meat. But I'm just sitting there looking at her. I said, no. She's just too pretty to do this to.
It's important to note that he incapacitated her by running her over with his car. There was no fighting for her life. There was no begging. There was no pleading. And a sadist needs that arousal, creating fear in someone. And so maybe he is learning something about what turns him on and what turns him off.
I'm interested in your age at your first violent fantasy.
Age-wise, I'm thinking between 9, 10, 11, 12.
Okay, tell me about that.
I had a really gorgeous cousin. I wondered what it would be like to fondle her deceased body, to the point that I tried to make that happen. I actually pushed her off a wall, and she busted her head open. Didn't die, thankfully, but had she, while waiting for the paramedics, I probably would have copped my first feel of a corpse.
Whether it happened or not is almost irrelevant. Gillis is giving us a window into how clear his sexual fantasies were and how far back they go. And there is a component of the need for them to be dead and unresponsive.
These things are not about relationships. These things are about objectification and power because he wants them dead. It's a really twisted way of pursuing your sexual interests, making death a precursor. To be this murderous and perverse, you have to have a well of despair and emptiness.
So these are isolated individuals, all of them when you encounter them.
Basically, yeah. I mean, Johnny May's the only one that I had extended dealings with. I genuinely liked her, and the feeling was mutual.
How did you happen upon her?
I was looking for her.
You were?
Yeah. She was intoxicated, and I picked Johnny up. We were driving around, talking a little, and she just leaned over and fell asleep in my lap. I pulled behind some closed bar. I was listening to music, stroking her hair. Then all of a sudden, I just got my one tie wrap. Picked her head up, pulled it, and that was it. And then pulled her out the car, and I laid her down and stripped her nude.
What prompted you to kill her?
The woman was salt of the earth. To this day, I don't know why. This was a woman I could have, like a wife, gotten anything from. I had nothing against her. She never did me wrong.
This is victim number 7. He likely is also experiencing a greater need for intensity, for that thrill and that high, which means it takes more and more to get the same rise. And maybe killing somebody close to him gave him that arousal that he wanted.
I mean, I was willing to kill someone I knew because I had this kind of itch that is frightening. You kind of get a feel for how disturbed he really is.
What happened to Johnny's hands?
Trust me, I don't know. I've never had a hand fetish. I'm more of a leg and man, personally. I also painted the fingernails. That was just something that I did with Johnny May. All the faces haunt me, but hers haunts me the most. I mean, I kissed her and closed her eyes, and she died.
He's reflecting a kind of tender attitude, and the fact that he would paint her fingernails, essentially prettier her up, does suggest something a little bit fetishistic. It's a very peculiar behavior, and it harkens back to his mother, dressing her up like a Barbie doll.
For Gillis, human beings aren't whole entities. They're a compilation of parts, sort of how we talked about his brain being different than him. I find myself wondering whether those hands are reminiscent of some earlier experiences that he had had.
What was your dad like?
I mean, he was a total screw-up, a total I was like 1 or 2 when he split, so I didn't know Daddy much. I didn't know him until I was 16. The second time we met, we had things at a flat here and there. I had to go pick up the things. There were, name it, all sort of sexual paraphernalia with chains up, as well as pictures of my dad. Men, girls, just a massive orgy. And I had 2 friends with me, too, who was like, so that's what sort of fella you are, huh? You know, God, I wanted to kill him, beyond it. That was the dirtiest, dirty.
What did they know?
You know, I was his son. Genes passed down. Jim, that made me scary. Am I going to grow up to do that? I know I grew up to do something.
This display of emotion is synthetic. It doesn't appear to be sincere or real, and I think it's a load of crap. You have a situation with a father who is estranged from his son. They have no relationship at all. So I find it hard to believe that he would have sent his son over to the house to pick up some things, and he just leaves all of these things about his personal sex life out and about. Gillis's references to the whips and the chains and orgies and things of that nature, I think really just gives us a window into how his leap into pornography addiction may have gone. It may have started with interests in sadomasochism and became increasingly more dark.
Sean, did your dad try to sexually assault you?
I don't know. After that moment, everything, every touch on the back, every, good voice under his lips, get you.
I also understand that wanting to remove the hands is, in effect, really extremely significant.
His actions of my father's hands and mine, the things they do, the things I do with them.
I think the hands makes for a good story. It's too convenient. It fits together too cleanly. His father left when he was 1 or 2 years old. And so he's just adopting this new story right before our very eyes in this interview. I don't find it credible. So I really take this as superficial attempts to look like he cares, like he has a sense of emotion or empathy, when in fact he doesn't.
He is feeling bad for himself, feeling like he's not.
So how many rounds do you remember firing?
15. Did he say anything to you?
Oh, Grandma, I love you.
Is he dead?
He's dead, ma'am.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh boy, oh boy.
If he was here right now, what would you say to him?
I'd kill him. I'd kill him.
911.
Yeah, there was some gunshots fired, about 5 of them behind my house, and now I can hear someone yelling, "Help me," in a weakened state. Another one.
3 more, okay.
And this person is screaming, "Help."
Yeah.
Estacio was found shot multiple times in his Fallbrook home. His mother-in-law, Cynthia Catherine Sidabaka, charged with the crime.
We are still currently investigating what the motive might be.
We want to know your name and a little bit about you.
What's your full name?
I forgot.
You know when you were born?
I don't know.
Was it in February?
Yeah, February 11th.
What was the year?
Today it's your birthday today.
Today's your birthday.
Yeah.
Happy birthday.
February 11th. What year?
Don't know.
Cynthia, you're not that old. You're only like 10 years older than me.
I had a real bad...
I know, and I'm sorry about that,
But they didn't take your driver's license away or anything, right? You can still drive.
Yeah.
She's letting the sheriff's deputies believe that she can't remember her name, she can't remember her date of birth, her age. These are things that are not uncommon to see sometimes when someone has a significant stroke. However, it seems unlikely against other aspects of her day-to-day functioning that we know about. What I think Sidabaka is showing us in this moment is that she hasn't fully decided how much responsibility she wants to take for the crime.
Something happened today at your house. Unfortunately, Laura's husband has passed away.
Huh?
Yes.
Huh?
Laura's husband was killed today.
You were killed when?
Today.
What time?
That's what we're trying to figure out.
Oh!
It's G a word.
Okay.
It's bizarre. Her wailing is a little bizarre. This looks feigned to me. She's pretending that she doesn't know anything about the crime in this scene, and the wail is a weak imitation of, I think, what she imagines an immediate expression of sorrow would be.
She goes from pretending to be confused to pretending to lament his loss very quickly, and I wouldn't expect to see that. I wouldn't expect her even necessarily to understand the news she was being given if she was anywhere near as confused or disoriented as she presented herself.
There's no secrets in here.
Okay.
That's okay. Because I know he's dead.
Okay.
Is he dead?
Should he be?
Yes.
If he was dead, why would he be dead? From what?
Killing him.
Now suddenly she's gone from not knowing her name to a level of anger, a level of bitterness, and doesn't sound like a whole lot of remorse. Sidabaka feels comfortable pivoting and taking responsibility and credit for killing her son-in-law because the detectives have now befriended her.
There's some relishment of her actions, and now she's got an audience that she can describe that to. For a psychopath, having an audience that they are commanding, the audience is looking to them, what are they going to say next? Even if it's shocking the audience, being in control can be a very satisfying thing for someone with psychopathy.
Okay, so hopefully we're gonna ask you some questions. We're trying to figure out what happened today, okay?
All right. I was getting dressed. He says, you can't go like that because it looks like you're ghetto in this. It's the only thing I have that was clean. He said something real derogatory.
I want to hear what he told you.
I can't say it.
Yes, you can.
Can't go.
He told you couldn't go because he didn't like the way you were dressed?
Right. Made me mad.
And what did you do when you went back to your room?
Got a gun.
And then what happened?
Went and shot him. Wasn't enough.
Did you say anything to him?
No.
Were you outside or inside?
Outside. I had to go back and get more. Another
magazine?
Yeah.
Where did you have it, in your room or in your car or somewhere
My
else?
car. Then I went and shot him twice. And then he went inside. He locked it from the inside. He said,
Oh, I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die.
that's okay. Boom!
You shot through the door. The glass?
Yeah, I got in and I shot him
How many times did you put more bullets in it?
3 times.
And he's on the ground. From him, how was he laying on the floor? Like this?
He's on his side or on his
He's
back?
on his back?
Yep.
Okay, now show me where you were. 3 times. How many rounds do you remember
15.
firing?
Did he say anything to you?
Grandma, I love you.
After you shot him, you said, Grandma, I love you?
Yeah.
She sounds monstrous as she's describing this man's last words and her desire to continue killing him. There's a tone of disgust in it, like that he would plead for his life to her, and the way she imitates it, she is angry at him.
With psychopaths, they are often angered and infuriated when people don't treat them the way they expect to be treated. For her, this is the final offense he can do. He's humiliating her, and so she's going to kill him and eliminate the problem.
Was it an overreaction? Yes. the number of bullets that he suffered was overkill. Sidabaka's behaviors are ruthless. She doesn't feel bad about it.
After you shot him, did you check to see if he was dead?
I didn't care.
I mean, did you check?
I didn't care. He's dead, isn't he?
Yeah, he's dead.
Yes?
Yes.
Good. I shot him. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, good. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You can take me whenever. Oh, God. Oh, God.
Her expression of emotion seems to come out of nowhere. It's sort of like the switch went on, the switch went off. And this is really common after people have had a stroke. What's consistent here, though, when we talk about psychopathy, is that she's happy he's dead.
The hard part to morally wrap your head around is that she would make that decision for so many other people. They have to live with knowing grandma killed dad. That's a real just lack of empathy or ability to empathize with her ostensibly loved ones.
Have you ever been that angry before?
No. No.
What did it feel like afterwards?
Oh.
Relief.
Yes.
My dad at times, it can be hard, but he's ultimately fair. Alpha personalities, conflict with a lot of other personality types, and she put on a good facade for years now, and so this is a shock to us, but it seems like she's been plotting this for a while.
Where did you get that gun?
I went and bought it.
Did you buy it because you knew you were going to have to take him out eventually?
About 5 years ago.
What did you do with the casings?
I saved them.
Where are they? Where are they, Cindy?
I put them right in there. Trash bag.
And you just put them in the trash can?
Yes.
On the surface, I wondered how much of her decision-making was impaired by the stroke, but clearly there are premeditated steps to this. And she took the time to pick up the casings. She took the time to clean up after herself. Sidabaka is definitely not a confused, disorganized, unintelligent person. This was an organized, systematic, methodically executed crime.
After you shot him, and what did you do?
Went to Denny's.
So after you had breakfast at Denny's, where did you go?
Went to gamble.
Where at?
Pachango.
Pachanga? Okay.
What time did you get to Changa?
About 9.
What did you play at Pachanga?
Poker.
Did you win any money?
About 300.
She took his life and she went to Denny's in a casino on her birthday. That's really concerning. That's a little more suggestive of just that indifference of human life, indifference towards her own grandchildren, her daughter.
That's what we see in psychopathy. They've taken the law into their own hands and they've settled the fantasy in their head or settled the score. And she feels, I think, entitled to celebrate. That lack of remorse is what we see in psychopathy.
That was a show.
I knew.
Okay.
I knew.
You were pleased with your work.
Right. Right, he was. I was.
Tell us about Laura's husband. You've had some interaction with him. What did you think of him? And why do you say that?
That's the big thumbs down. You didn't like him.
What kind of things did he do that you didn't like? He doesn't sound like he was a very nice guy.
Sprays you.
With what?
water. She doesn't do anything. What's he do? Nothing. He makes my daughter work. You know what? He hasn't worked for 13 years. He's always on the computer.
Doing what?
I don't know. I don't want to talk about him.
Is there anything else that we didn't ask you that you think was important that we know?
He's so mean to everybody. He's so mean to everybody. Even his own family. You know.
It's okay, Mom. It's okay, Mom. It's okay, Mom.
Why didn't you call the police when he was mean?
I don't use the phone.
But you could have asked your daughter to call the police. You could have had him put to...
No, I take it out of it.
Why didn't you call the police and have him arrested? Why did you have to kill him?
I didn't want him back. He had to go off. He's deranged. Doesn't think straight.
In her behavior, we do see an element of narcissism. She has to match the fantasy in her head about how this problem would have to be resolved. So calling the police was out of the question. It wouldn't result in his death. In psychopathy, people don't believe in adhering to the social rules. They behave by their own rules, and they can take matters into their own hand.
Is he dead?
He's dead, ma'am.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh boy, oh boy.
If he was here right now, what would you say to him?
I'd kill him. I'd kill him.
You kill him again?
Yes, he is. So evil.
What about markings on her left wrist back? Left forearm?
They were there when I was 15.
Wow.
You know. So my mother was very heroic. You know.
She alludes to the idea that she had a troubled childhood. There absolutely could have been some of her early experiences and negative feelings about her own family and maybe a domineering parent projected onto her son-in-law, that maybe she felt that her grandchildren experienced their father in a more domineering and rigid way than he may actually have been. The overkill that you see in that crime may very well have been her tapping into rage that she had about some of her early life experiences.
I was guilty.
You know what you did was wrong.
Yeah, it was wrong. It was wrong. I know it was.
But it was something that you feel like you had to do.
Yes, yes, I had to. You had to tell her. I don't want the children that I had to kill them.
Well, eventually they're gonna know, Mom.
How do you want them to find out?
You want to tell them yourself?
Please. Please don't. Oh God, why? Because. Why? I don't want Please don't. Don't, please. Wasn't it an accident? It was an accident, wasn't it? Yeah. Oh, I did it. I'm sorry.
I think it is telling that her daughter was upset. It suggests to me that her daughter was in a full relationship with the victim. She wasn't begging her mother, please get rid of someone for me, and had emotionally detached from him.
You really see a very good illustration of how fused she is in her own head, that what is her reality must be her daughter's reality. The story she had going in her head is that she was doing the right thing for her daughter and her daughter would be relieved. And it's not really until this moment that you see that the light bulb goes off in her head that she's created a real mess with her daughter. When people are psychologically fused with their children, there's no room in their reality for their experiences and the experiences of their children.
Please. Yeah. Oh, God. How did you do that? I wanted to. 13 years. What are you going to do? Oh, honey. Yeah. Okay, look at you. Mom, you have to do. Why did you do that? What? Oh. 13 years I wanted to go get him. He was so mean to you. All of us. And this is my birthday.
Sidabaka gave herself a birthday gift, and she didn't consider the consequences that it would have on her daughter, her grandchildren, the very people that she claimed.
There are some crimes that end when the handcuffs click shut. There are others that linger for years, buried beneath court records, fading newspaper ink, and the fragile memory of a town that would rather forget. And then there are the rare cases that seem unwilling to die. Cases that continue breathing long after the victims are gone. Cases that leave behind a question so unsettling that every answer somehow feels incomplete. Tonight's story begins with an act of kindness. Not greed. Not revenge. Not a feud between enemies. It begins with a door opening. A family sees a young man standing alone in the fading California light. He looks tired. Lost. Drifting. The kind of face people pass every day without remembering. A stranger. A wanderer. Someone with nowhere else to go. The family could have turned away. Most people probably would have. But they didn't. They offered him food. They offered him shelter. They offered him trust. Years later, investigators, journalists, and true crime researchers would revisit that moment again and again, wondering whether anything could have changed what followed. Was there a warning hidden in his eyes? A detail someone overlooked? A strange comment that seemed harmless at the time? Or was the darkness already there, waiting patiently beneath the surface, invisible to everyone around him? The truth is that evil rarely announces itself. It rarely arrives carrying a weapon. More often, it enters quietly. It sits at the dinner table. It smiles. It says thank you. And it waits. The house stood in a peaceful corner of California during an era many Americans would later romanticize. It was a time remembered through photographs filled with bright sunlight, polished automobiles, and families smiling on front porches. But photographs lie. Every decade has its shadows. Every community has its secrets. And every ordinary street is only one terrible night away from becoming a crime scene. The people who lived near the Prendergast family would later struggle to reconcile what happened with the image they had of their neighborhood. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed dangerous. No one expected to wake up and find themselves living inside a nightmare. Yet somewhere in that quiet landscape, something was changing. A tension was growing. Not visible. Not dramatic. Just small fractures forming beneath the surface. The kind that nobody notices until the foundation finally gives way. Imagine a home lit by warm evening lamps. The sound of dishes being put away. The familiar rhythm of daily life. Conversations about tomorrow. Plans for next week. The simple assumption that morning will arrive exactly as expected. For most of us, that assumption is so natural we barely think about it. But every true crime story is, in some way, the story of a future that never happened. The birthday that was never celebrated. The trip that was never taken. The conversation that was never finished. The ordinary moments that suddenly become precious because they were the last. On the night that concerns us, no one knew they were approaching such a moment. No one knew that history was quietly moving toward a point from which there would be no return. The stranger who had once been welcomed into a home had become something else. Something difficult to understand. Something even harder to predict. Accounts describing him painted a troubling picture. A man drifting through life. A man carrying burdens few could fully see. A man whose behavior increasingly unsettled those around him. But troubling behavior and murder are not the same thing. Many troubled people never hurt anyone. Many disturbed thoughts remain only thoughts. That distinction is important. Because the question at the heart of this case is not simply how violence happened. It is how trust collapsed. How kindness transformed into fear. How hospitality became tragedy. And perhaps most chilling of all, whether the disaster could have been prevented. The hours before a crime often seem ordinary in retrospect. Investigators learn this quickly. Witnesses remember mundane details. A light left on. A door left open. A car parked in its usual place. The world never announces that catastrophe is approaching. Instead, it allows people to continue believing everything is normal. That illusion remained intact until it shattered. And when it did, it shattered completely. What authorities would eventually discover inside that home shocked even experienced investigators. Scenes of violence have a way of imprinting themselves upon those who witness them. Years later, detectives may forget addresses, dates, or procedural details. But they rarely forget certain rooms. Certain images. Certain silences. The kind of silence that follows unimaginable brutality. The kind that seems to linger in the air long after everyone has gone. For the people connected to this case, that silence would become permanent. Because the murders were only the beginning. If this story ended with an arrest, it might have faded into the background of criminal history. Another tragic case. Another courtroom. Another conviction. But that is not what happened. The man accused of committing the killings would later become the center of a mystery that remains haunting decades afterward. A mystery involving confinement, escape, disappearance, and an ending that may never truly be known. Some believe he died. Others believe he started over somewhere else. A new name. A new face. A new life built atop unimaginable violence. Theories multiplied as years passed. Rumors spread. Sightings surfaced and vanished. Questions remained unanswered. And somewhere within those unanswered questions lies the reason this case continues to fascinate people so many years later. Not because of sensationalism. Not because of morbid curiosity. But because unresolved endings challenge our sense of order. We want stories to conclude neatly. We want villains caught. We want justice delivered. We want certainty. This case offers none. Instead, it leaves behind an unsettling possibility. That a man capable of extraordinary violence may have simply disappeared into the world. Gone. Not dead. Not found. Just gone. Yet before we explore the investigation, before we examine the evidence, before we follow detectives through the twists and frustrations of the case, we must return to where every tragedy begins. With people. Real people. a husband, a wife, a home, a decision made out of compassion. Because beneath every headline is a human story. Beneath every crime statistic is a life interrupted. And beneath every mystery is a loss that cannot be measured. The names at the center of this story are James and Marie Prendergast. For them, the future still existed. Tomorrow still mattered. Plans still waited to be fulfilled. They could not know that their names would one day become associated with one of the most disturbing and enduring criminal mysteries connected to their era. They could not know that strangers decades later would still be discussing the events that unfolded around them. And they certainly could not know that an act of generosity would place them on a collision course with disaster. As we begin this journey, remember that the most frightening stories are rarely the ones that begin with obvious monsters. The truly frightening stories begin with ordinary people. Ordinary places. Ordinary decisions. Because those are the stories that feel closest to us. Those are the stories that force us to wonder what we would have done. Would we have opened the door? Would we have offered help? Would we have recognized the danger? Or would we have done exactly the same thing? Tonight, we step back into a forgotten chapter of American crime history. A chapter marked by violence, mystery, and a question that has refused to disappear. A question that echoes through every account of the case. What became of the man who walked into the lives of James and Marie Prendergast? And left behind devastation before vanishing into the shadows? California in the late 1950s was a place that seemed to exist between two worlds. One world was the image preserved in family photographs. Bright skies. Freshly painted houses. New automobiles parked proudly in driveways. Children riding bicycles beneath rows of telephone poles that stretched toward the horizon. It was the America many people dreamed about, an America that appeared confident about its future. The other world existed beneath the surface. It was quieter. Harder to see. A world where loneliness traveled from town to town along highways. A world where troubled men drifted across the country carrying invisible wounds. A world where not every smile concealed happiness and not every neighborhood was as safe as it appeared. The story of James and Marie Prendergast unfolded at the meeting point of those two worlds. To understand what happened, we have to leave behind the headlines and police reports for a moment. We have to imagine the landscape before tragedy arrived. The roads. The homes. The routines. The small details that seemed unimportant at the time. Because crime does not emerge from a vacuum. It enters an already existing world. A world filled with ordinary lives. Morning sunlight often arrived gently across the California countryside. The air carried the scent of dry earth, cut grass, and distant fields warming beneath the rising sun. Cars moved slowly along narrow roads. Shopkeepers unlocked doors. Families prepared for another predictable day. For most residents, life followed familiar rhythms. People knew their neighbors. They greeted one another in passing. The local grocery store was more than a place to buy food. It was where conversations happened. News traveled from person to person. Stories spread long before they ever reached newspapers. The Prendergasts were part of that world. They were not celebrities. They were not wealthy. They were not people who expected history to remember their names. In many ways, they represented countless American families of the era. They worked. They worried about bills. They planned for the future. They believed in helping others. And perhaps that final quality would prove to be the most important. Their home was the kind of place visitors described as welcoming. Not because it was luxurious, but because it felt lived in. It carried the marks of daily life. Furniture arranged for comfort rather than appearance. Photographs displayed where family members could see them. Familiar objects occupying familiar places. A home reveals its owners in subtle ways. Some houses feel cold. Others feel temporary. The Prendergast home seemed different. It projected stability. The kind of stability that makes strangers feel safe. The kind of stability that encourages trust. Neighbors later struggled to explain why the events that followed seemed so impossible. When people looked at the house after the murders, they often described a strange feeling. The structure itself had not changed. The walls were the same. The windows remained where they had always been. Yet everything felt different. As though violence had permanently altered the atmosphere surrounding the property. But that feeling belonged to the future. At the beginning of our story, none of that existed yet. The house was simply a home. A place where people laughed, argued, planned, worried, and slept. A place where tomorrow seemed guaranteed. Beyond the Prendergast household, America itself was changing. The decade was often remembered as prosperous, but prosperity did not reach everyone equally. Across the country, thousands of individuals drifted between towns searching for work, purpose, or escape. Some carried economic hardships. Others carried psychological burdens that few people understood at the time. Mental health treatment in the 1950s remained limited by modern standards. Conditions that might receive diagnosis and support today often went unrecognized. Troubled behavior was frequently misunderstood, ignored, or hidden. In that environment, people could fall through the cracks. They could disappear into isolation. They could travel from community to community without anyone truly knowing who they were. One such traveler was Carl Alfred Eder. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. No flashing warning signs. No dramatic introduction. Just another young man moving through the vast geography of post-war America. Yet many of history's most unsettling crimes begin exactly that way. Not with spectacle. With normality. The danger of hindsight is that it tempts us to imagine inevitability. We look backward and convince ourselves the outcome was obvious. We search for clues that seem glaring only because we already know how the story ends. Reality rarely works that way. Human beings are complicated. Behavior is complicated. Most people who seem troubled never become killers. Most acts of kindness never lead to tragedy. The people who encountered Eder during those early days could not see the future. They saw only the present. A man who appeared to need help. Someone who seemed adrift. Someone who might benefit from compassion. And compassion was not an unusual value in communities like theirs. The generation that lived through economic depression and global war often understood hardship intimately. Helping someone in need was not always considered remarkable. Sometimes it was simply the decent thing to do. That cultural attitude formed the backdrop for everything that followed. The roads stretching across California connected more than cities. They connected lives. Strangers met one another every day. Some encounters lasted minutes. Others changed destinies. One of those encounters would eventually bind the Prendergasts and Carl Eder together in ways none of them could anticipate. The weather during those years often seemed endless in its predictability. Long afternoons baked beneath California sunlight. Evenings cooled slowly. Crickets emerged after dark. Porch lights glowed against gathering shadows. There is something haunting about ordinary evenings in true crime stories. Not because they contain obvious danger. Because they do not. The world continues exactly as expected. People eat dinner. Neighbors wave goodnight. Dogs bark in distant yards. And somewhere nearby, events are quietly moving toward catastrophe. No one notices. No one ever notices. That is what makes these stories so unsettling. The distance between normal life and irreversible tragedy is often far smaller than we imagine. The Prendergasts likely viewed their future through the same lens as everyone else around them. There would be holidays. Birthdays. Conversations not yet spoken. Years stretching ahead. Like all of us, they lived with an unspoken assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. Crime shatters that assumption. Not only for victims, for entire communities. Because when something horrific happens in a familiar place, people begin questioning everything they thought they understood. They examine memories differently. They reinterpret encounters. They revisit old conversations searching for meaning. Years later, those connected to the case would continue asking the same questions. When did things begin to change? What warning signs existed? Could anyone have recognized them? Or were the seeds of violence already buried too deeply to be seen? Such questions rarely produce satisfying answers. Human behavior does not follow simple formulas. Some individuals reveal their intentions openly. Others conceal them so effectively that even those closest to them remain unaware. This uncertainty would become one of the defining characteristics of the Prendergast case. Because the story was not merely about murder. It was about trust. Trust granted. Trust tested. Trust destroyed. The setting in which these events unfolded matters because it highlights a painful contrast. The safer a place appears, the more shocking violence becomes. A dangerous neighborhood expects danger. A peaceful community expects peace. When brutality invades that peace, the psychological impact extends far beyond the immediate crime. Fear spreads. Confidence erodes. People lock doors they previously left open. Strangers become objects of suspicion. Kindness becomes harder to give. In that sense, crimes create victims beyond those directly harmed. They alter the behavior of everyone who hears the story. The Prendergast murders would eventually do exactly that. But before investigators arrived, before courtrooms filled, before newspapers printed headlines, there existed only a quiet California community living through another ordinary chapter of its history. Children played beneath afternoon skies. Families gathered around dinner tables. Traffic moved along familiar roads. Life continued uninterrupted. Or at least it appeared to. Because beneath the visible world, another story was slowly taking shape. A story involving isolation, instability, and decisions whose consequences would echo for decades. The future mystery surrounding Carl Edder's disappearance would one day capture public imagination. Researchers would debate theories. Writers would revisit evidence. Questions would survive long after witnesses aged and memories faded. Yet all of that remained hidden beyond the horizon. At this point in the story, nobody was thinking about future investigations. Nobody was imagining prison escapes. Nobody was predicting one of the most disturbing chapters connected to the case. There was only the present moment. A home. A family. A stranger. And a chain of events beginning so quietly that it almost escaped notice. History often announces itself with dramatic moments. A gunshot. A scream. An arrest. But the most important moments frequently arrive in silence. A decision to stop and help. An invitation offered. A door unlocked. A place at the table. Tiny moments. Ordinary moments. Moments that appear meaningless until viewed through the lens of tragedy. The Prendergast story was built from such moments. And as we move deeper into this case, we will discover how an act rooted in generosity gradually transformed into fear, suspicion, and unimaginable violence. Because every nightmare has a beginning. And sometimes that beginning looks exactly like kindness. Every murder investigation begins with a victim. Every headline focuses on a crime. Every courtroom centers on a defendant. Yet somewhere along the way, the people whose lives were stolen often become secondary characters in their own story. Photographs replace personalities. Names replace dreams. Dates replace memories. Before James and Marie Prendergast became victims, they were simply two people building a life together. A life that, from the outside, appeared ordinary. And perhaps that is exactly why their story continues to resonate decades later. Because there was nothing extraordinary about them. They were not wealthy industrialists. They were not public figures. They were not people surrounded by controversy. They were the kind of people who exist in every town across America. The kind of people whose lives rarely attract attention. Until tragedy forces the world to notice. The California they called home was a place of promise. The post-war years had brought change to communities across the state. New roads connected growing towns. Businesses expanded. Families pursued opportunities that previous generations could only imagine. For many Americans, the future seemed bright. James Prendergast belonged to a generation that valued hard work above almost everything else. People who knew men like James often described them in similar ways. Dependable. Practical. Steady. The type of person who approached life one day at a time. The type of person who understood that most achievements were earned gradually rather than suddenly. There were no shortcuts. No miracles. Just effort. The rhythm of daily responsibility. Wake up. Go to work. Return home. Take care of the people who mattered. Repeat. To outsiders, that routine might seem uneventful. To James, it represented something important. Stability. A foundation upon which a family could build a future. Marie Prendergast brought something equally important to their home. Warmth. Not the dramatic kind often portrayed in movies. The quieter kind. The kind revealed through small gestures. Remembering birthdays. Checking on neighbors. Preparing meals. Listening when someone needed to talk. Creating an environment where people felt welcome. Those qualities rarely make headlines. Yet they often define the emotional center of a household. A home is more than walls and furniture. It is shaped by the people living inside it. By their habits. Their personalities. Their kindness. Their flaws. The Prendergast home reflected both James and Marie. It was not merely a structure. It was an extension of who they were. Visitors felt that immediately. Some homes make people feel like guests. Others make them feel like they belong. The Prendergasts seemed to possess a gift for the latter. Years after the murders, that fact would become especially painful for those trying to understand the crime. Because generosity sits at the center of this story. Not violence. Not hatred. Generosity. The same generosity that made people trust them. The same generosity that ultimately connected them to the man accused of destroying everything they had built. The tragedy becomes even more heartbreaking when viewed through the lens of ordinary life. Imagine a typical evening inside the house. A lamp glowing softly in a living room corner. A coffee cup resting on a table. The quiet sounds of conversation filling spaces between moments of silence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing historic. Just life unfolding as it always had. Human beings rarely recognize which moments will someday matter. A laugh shared over dinner. A casual remark. A plan for next month. At the time, such moments seem insignificant. Only later do they become precious. Only later do people wish they had paid closer attention. The people who knew James and Marie remembered them not through newspaper articles but through these details. Through memories. Through routines. Through everyday interactions. That is how real lives are measured. Not by major events, but by thousands of small moments accumulated over time. A neighbor needing help carrying groceries. A conversation across a fence. A ride offered to someone without transportation. The world often celebrates grand acts of heroism. Yet communities are built through ordinary kindness. And the Prendergasts appear to understand that better than most. This helps explain why they made the choice that would later define the narrative surrounding the case. To understand that choice, we must first understand the values behind it. The America of the 1950s encouraged self-reliance, but it also encouraged community. Many families remembered hardship from previous decades. The Great Depression had taught difficult lessons about survival. World War II had reinforced ideas of sacrifice and mutual support. Helping others was not always viewed as exceptional. Sometimes it was simply expected. A person in need deserved assistance. A traveler deserved compassion. A stranger deserved a chance. Those beliefs influence countless decisions made by ordinary people every day. Most of those decisions ended well. One did not. There is a tendency when studying true crime to search for moments when victims made mistakes. But framing the story that way often misses a deeper truth. Kindness is not a mistake. Trust is not a mistake. Compassion is not a mistake. The responsibility for violence belongs to those who commit it, not those who extend help. That distinction matters when discussing James and Marie, because their actions reflected empathy rather than recklessness. They saw a human being who appeared to need assistance. They responded accordingly. What followed says far more about the offender than the victims. Yet before violence entered their lives, there were no reasons to think in such terms. No visible countdown. No dramatic warning. Just ordinary days continuing one after another. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. The seasons changed. Life moved forward. If someone had visited the Prendergast household during that period, they likely would have observed nothing unusual. Perhaps they would have noticed family photographs. Perhaps they would have admired the sense of comfort inside the home. Perhaps they would have left believing the family had many years ahead of them. That assumption would have seemed entirely reasonable. Because tragedy rarely advertises its arrival. The future remains hidden until it becomes the present. One of the most haunting aspects of homicide cases is the knowledge that victims continue making plans right up until the end. They schedule appointments. Discuss future holidays. Talk about repairs they want to make around the house. They assume they will have time. Everyone does. James and Marie were no different. Their lives were still moving forward. Their story was still being written. The ending had not yet arrived. And that is what makes their loss so difficult to process. Violence does not merely end lives. It steals futures. The future birthdays. The future conversations. The future ordinary moments. Everything that would have happened if a single decision by a single individual had been different. When investigators later reconstructed the events surrounding the murders, they inevitably focused on evidence. Timelines. Locations. Actions. But evidence alone cannot capture what was truly lost. Evidence explains how people died. It does not explain how they lived. To understand that, we must imagine the world through their eyes. A world that still felt secure. A world where helping someone in need seemed natural. A world where danger remained abstract and distant. The Prendergasts could not know that they were approaching the final chapter of their lives. No victim ever does. That ignorance is one of the cruelest aspects of violent crime. The future disappears without warning. One day exists. The next never arrives. For the community surrounding them, the murders would eventually become a defining memory. People would remember where they were when they heard the news. They would remember conversations that followed. They would remember the shock, the disbelief, the questions. Yet those reactions belong to the future. At this point in our story, James and Marie were still alive. Still planning. Still trusting. Still opening their home to others. Still believing that kindness was worthwhile. Perhaps that belief sounds naive through the lens of what happened later. But it should not. A society without trust becomes something colder. Something smaller. Something driven entirely by fear. The Prendergasts chose a different way of living. They chose compassion. And for a time, that compassion simply looked like another ordinary part of their lives. No one could see the darkness approaching. No one could predict the violence waiting just beyond the horizon. No one could know that the names James and Marie Prendergast would someday become associated with one of the most disturbing crimes connected to their community. For now, they remained what they had always been. A husband and wife. A family. Two people sharing a home and a future. Two people whose greatest legacy would ultimately become a painful reminder of how fragile safety can be. And as the days continued to pass, another figure was slowly moving closer to the center of their story. A troubled young drifter whose path had begun intersecting with theirs. A man carrying burdens that few understood. A man who would soon step across the threshold of their lives. A man named Carl Alfred Eder. The moment they met him may have seemed insignificant. Just another encounter. Just another stranger. Just another opportunity to help someone who appeared to need it. But history often hides itself inside ordinary moments. And the encounter that brought Carl Eder into the Prendergast's world would eventually set into motion a chain of events that neither side could possibly imagine. The victims had now entered the final chapter of their story. They simply did not know it yet. There is a moment before every tragedy when everything still appears salvageable. A moment when the future has not yet broken apart. A moment when a different choice, a different conversation, or a different turn of events seems as though it might still change the outcome. Looking back on the story of James and Marie Prendergast, it is impossible not to search for that moment. Perhaps it arrived during a tense discussion. Perhaps it appeared in a worried glance exchanged across a room. Perhaps it came in the form of a growing realization that the young man they had welcomed into their lives was becoming increasingly difficult to understand. Whatever the case, by the time the final days arrived, something had changed. The atmosphere surrounding Carl Alfred Eder no longer carried the same sense of uncertainty that had marked his arrival. The sympathy that had once defined the relationship was beginning to give way to concern. Concern is a subtle emotion. It rarely appears all at once. Instead, it grows slowly. One unusual comment. One uncomfortable interaction. One incident that feels strange but not alarming. Then another. And another. Until eventually a person begins asking themselves a question they never expected to ask. Is something wrong? For the Prendergasts, that question may have emerged gradually. The details that survive from the case suggest increasing unease surrounding Eder's behavior. Exactly how those concerns manifested remains difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Yet what matters is that a line had begun to form between guest and host. A line that had not existed before. The kindness remained. The compassion remained. But alongside them came tension. And tension has a way of reshaping the emotional landscape of a home. Rooms that once felt comfortable begin to feel smaller. Conversations become more cautious. Silences grow longer. People start measuring their words. They start paying attention to things they previously ignored. The ordinary rhythm of life becomes disrupted. Not dramatically. Not immediately. Just enough for people to notice. As the relationship deteriorated, the possibility emerged that Eder might need to leave. To outside observers, such a development would have appeared entirely reasonable. Temporary arrangements end. Guests move on. People go separate ways. It happens every day. But human beings are complicated. What seems ordinary to one person may feel devastating to another. Rejection, whether real or perceived, can produce powerful emotional reactions. Especially in individuals already struggling with instability, isolation, or unresolved psychological conflicts. This reality would later become one of the central questions surrounding the case. What was happening inside Carl Eder's mind during those final days? What thoughts occupied him as events moved toward disaster? No investigation could ever fully answer that question. The human mind remains inaccessible in ways evidence never can overcome. Investigators can reconstruct actions. They can establish timelines. They can analyze behavior. But they cannot truly enter another person's thoughts. And so the final descent toward violence remains partially hidden behind a wall of uncertainty. The day itself arrived like any other. That is often the most haunting detail. The world did not stop. The sun still rose. Cars still traveled familiar roads. Neighbors continued their routines. People went to work. Meals were prepared. Conversations took place. Nothing in the wider community suggested that catastrophe was approaching. Somewhere beyond public view, however, events were moving toward a point from which there would be no return. Hours passed. Perhaps tension lingered inside the household. Perhaps difficult conversations occurred. Perhaps decisions were discussed. The exact sequence remains obscured by time. What is known is that eventually the situation crossed a threshold. A threshold separating conflict from violence. Once crossed, there would be no way back. The attack that followed would leave a lasting scar on everyone connected to the case. Not only because lives were lost, but because of the apparent betrayal embedded within the crime itself. Violence committed by strangers is frightening. Violence committed by someone welcomed into a home carries a different emotional weight. It transforms trust into vulnerability. It forces people to confront the possibility that danger can emerge from places once considered safe. Within the walls of the Prendergast home, an unimaginable confrontation unfolded. The exact details of those final moments may never be fully known. No surviving account can perfectly recreate what James and Marie experienced. No report can capture every word spoken. No investigation can recover every second. What remains is the knowledge that a terrible struggle occurred. A struggle that ended in irreversible loss. When violence erupts inside a home, the setting itself becomes part of the tragedy. Homes are supposed to represent safety. They are where people retreat from the dangers of the outside world. They are where families gather. Where memories accumulate. Where ordinary life unfolds. To violate that space is to violate something deeply personal. The Prendergast residence ceased being merely a building that day. It became a crime scene. A place forever divided into two eras. Before and after. The distinction matters because communities remember such locations differently. People drive past them years later and think not about architecture but about events. About loss. About unanswered questions. About the fragile boundary separating security from chaos. At some point after the violence ended, silence settled over the property. A silence unlike any that had existed before. The ordinary sounds of daily life were gone. The conversations. The movement. The routines. Everything that had once defined the household had abruptly stopped. Outside, meanwhile, the rest of the world continued unaware. Neighbors carried on with their evenings. Lights appeared in nearby homes. People finished dinners. Listened to radios. Prepared for sleep. Few could have imagined what had taken place only a short distance away. That contrast between ordinary life and hidden horror appears repeatedly throughout criminal history. Entire communities often remain unaware of tragedy until long after it has occurred. The realization arrives later. Sometimes hours later. Sometimes days. And when it arrives, it changes everything. As darkness deepened over the area, the consequences of what had happened remained concealed behind walls that had once sheltered a family. The individuals responsible for investigating the case had not yet been called. No emergency vehicles had arrived. No newspaper headlines existed. No courtroom proceedings had begun. At that moment, there was only absence. The absence of the lives that had occupied the home. The absence of normality. The absence of a future that had suddenly been erased. For Carl Eder, however, the story did not end at the scene. That fact would become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Many murder cases conclude with immediate capture. Suspects are located quickly. Questions are answered rapidly. The path from crime to arrest remains relatively straightforward. This case would prove more complicated. The events following the killings would eventually introduce layers of mystery that extended far beyond the original crime itself. But those developments belong to the future. For now, the central reality remained painfully simple. 2 lives had been taken. A family had been shattered. A community was on the verge of learning that one of its most terrifying fears had become real. The significance of that loss cannot be measured solely through investigative records. It exists in the empty spaces left behind. The conversations that would never occur. The milestones that would never be reached. The years that would never be lived. Every homicide creates such absences. They spread outward through families, friendships, and communities like ripples moving across water. Long after evidence is collected and court cases conclude, those absences remain. The murders of James and Marie Prendergast created precisely that kind of void. A void that would continue expanding as more details emerged. Because once authorities began piecing together what had happened, they would discover that this was not merely a story about violence. It was also a story about trust betrayed. A story about warning signs noticed too late. A story about a troubled drifter whose path crossed with a compassionate family. And eventually, it would become a story about disappearance. About unanswered questions. About a man who seemed to vanish into history after leaving devastation behind. But before investigators could pursue those mysteries, they first had to confront the reality waiting inside the Prendergast home. Someone would eventually notice something was wrong. Someone would make the call. Someone would open the door to a scene that would forever alter the course of the case. And with that discovery, the quiet tragedy hidden within the house would become a public nightmare. The investigation was about to begin. The discovery of a violent crime often begins with something deceptively ordinary. A missed appointment. An unanswered telephone call. A curtain that remains closed longer than usual. A neighbor noticing that something feels wrong. Rarely does anyone wake up expecting to become part of a murder investigation. More often, people stumble into tragedy while attempting to explain a simple absence. That pattern would repeat itself in the aftermath of what happened inside the Prendergast home. At first, there was no dramatic announcement. No immediate realization that a crime had occurred. Only uncertainty. The kind that appears when familiar routines suddenly stop. Human beings are creatures of habit. We notice when someone fails to follow a pattern. The shopkeeper who never opens his store. The friend who never misses a meeting. The neighbor who always waves from the porch but does not appear. Such details may seem insignificant individually. Together, they become warnings. Warnings that something has interrupted the normal flow of life. As concern began to grow, attempts were likely made to reach the Prendergasts. Perhaps someone knocked on the door. Perhaps a relative became worried. Perhaps a friend expected an answer that never came. The exact circumstances have faded with time, but the emotional reality remains easy to imagine. At first, concern. Then confusion. Then the slow emergence of fear. Because unanswered questions tend to create their own momentum. People begin searching for explanations. Maybe they left unexpectedly. Maybe they are busy. Maybe there is a misunderstanding. Yet with every passing hour, those explanations become harder to believe. Eventually someone made the decision to investigate further. It was a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. Crime scenes are often remembered through photographs and forensic reports. What those records fail to capture is the emotional shock experienced by the first person who discovers them. There is a moment when the mind struggles to process what the eyes are seeing. A moment when reality seems to fracture. A moment when ordinary assumptions collapse. The Prendergast home had once represented comfort and routine. Now it represented something entirely different. The person who first realized the truth likely carried that memory forever. Some images never disappear. No matter how many years pass. No matter how much time softens other memories. Certain scenes remain frozen. Permanent. Unchanging. Inside the residence, the aftermath of violence told a story before investigators ever arrived. A story of chaos where order once existed. A story of lives interrupted without warning. A story written not in words but in physical evidence. Every crime scene contains two versions of reality. The first is the emotional reality. The horror experienced by those who witness it. The second is the forensic reality. The silent collection of clues waiting to be interpreted. Investigators are trained to move beyond emotion and focus on evidence. Yet even experienced detectives are human. Some scenes affect them more than others. Particularly those involving extreme violence. Particularly those involving victims whose lives appear entirely disconnected from criminal activity. The murders of James and Marie Prendergast belong to that category. The brutality of the attack immediately elevated the seriousness of the investigation. This was not a mystery involving natural causes. This was not an accident. This was homicide. And homicide demands answers. The arrival of law enforcement transformed the home into something unfamiliar. The property became a controlled environment. Officers secured entrances. Investigators documented observations. Photographers preserved details before anything could be disturbed. Every object suddenly mattered. Every mark. Every stain. Every displaced item. The challenge facing investigators was straightforward in theory and enormously complicated in practice. What had happened? Who was responsible? And where was that person now? The search for those answers began with the scene itself. Crime scenes speak. Not through words. Through patterns. An overturned chair may suggest a struggle. A damaged doorway may indicate forced movement. The position of objects may reveal sequences of events. Forensic investigators learn to interpret these silent messages. They reconstruct actions from consequences. They build timelines from fragments. They transform disorder into narrative. The Prendergast residence offered numerous fragments. Each one represented a piece of a larger puzzle. Yet puzzles are frustrating because individual pieces rarely make sense on their own. Investigators needed context. They needed victimology. They needed to understand who James and Marie were and who might have wanted to harm them. That process began almost immediately. Detectives started asking questions. Who had recently seen the victims? Who visited the home? Had there been conflicts? Threats? Financial problems? Personal disputes? Most homicide investigations begin by examining the victim's relationships. Statistically, violence often originates from someone known to the victim. Family members. Friends. Acquaintances. Business associates. The closer the relationship, the more scrutiny it receives. As detectives worked through this process, one name began attracting attention. Carl Alfred Eder. The drifter who had once received shelter from the family. The young man whose behavior had reportedly become increasingly troubling. The guest whose presence inside the household had generated growing concern. At first, investigators could not simply assume guilt. Suspicion is not evidence. Every case requires proof. But experienced detectives understand something important. Certain names appear repeatedly during interviews for a reason. When multiple people independently point investigators toward the same individual, that individual deserves closer examination. Eder quickly became that person. Witnesses helped establish context. They described his connection to the victims. They discussed his behavior. They recounted observations that, in hindsight, seemed more significant than they had appeared at the time. Hindsight is a powerful force in criminal investigations. Actions that once seemed merely unusual suddenly acquire new meaning after violence occurs. A strange comment. An angry reaction. A tense interaction. Each detail is revisited through a different lens. Investigators began assembling those details one by one. Meanwhile, the crime scene itself continued yielding information. Forensic analysis in the late 1950s lacked many of the technologies available today. There was no advanced DNA profiling. No sophisticated digital evidence. No modern databases capable of instantly connecting information across jurisdictions. Detectives relied heavily on observation, interviews, physical evidence, and intuition developed through experience. Their work demanded patience. Small details carried enormous importance. A fingerprint. A witness statement. A timeline inconsistency. Any one of these elements could determine whether a case moved forward or stalled indefinitely. The Prendergast investigation progressed quickly because detectives soon recognized they were not dealing with a random mystery involving countless possibilities. The victim-offender relationship appeared increasingly central to understanding the crime. The evidence suggested that whoever committed the murders likely possessed familiarity with the household. Familiarity changes everything. A stranger must first gain access. A familiar person already has it. That distinction narrows investigative focus dramatically. As the hours turned into days, pressure intensified. Communities expect answers following violent crimes. Families demand justice. Newspapers seek information. Rumors spread faster than facts. Investigators must work carefully while facing enormous public expectation. The murders of James and Marie generated exactly that environment. Shock rippled through the area. People struggled to reconcile the brutality of the crime with their understanding of the victims. How could something like this happen? Why would anyone target them? What possible motive existed? Such questions circulated everywhere. In homes. In businesses. In conversations between neighbors. Fear followed close behind. Violent crimes do more than take lives. They challenge assumptions about safety. If something terrible can happen to people like the Prendergasts, what does that mean for everyone else? The psychological effect is profound. Communities begin locking doors. Watching strangers more carefully. Questioning whether danger exists closer than they once believed. For detectives, however, fear could not become a distraction. They needed evidence. And increasingly, that evidence seemed to point toward Carl Eder. His connection to the victims was undeniable. His recent behavior attracted attention. Most importantly, investigators needed to determine his whereabouts. Finding him became a priority. A suspect can answer questions. A missing suspect creates new ones. The search intensified. Information moved between officers. Witness accounts were reviewed. Timelines were compared. Every effort focused on locating the individual whose name had emerged repeatedly throughout the early stages of the investigation. The case had now entered a critical phase. The crime scene had revealed violence. Interviews had revealed possible motive. The victimology had revealed a significant relationship. What remained was the suspect himself. Somewhere beyond the boundaries of the crime scene, Carl Alfred Eder remained the most important unanswered question in the investigation. Was he fleeing? Was he hiding? Was he planning his next move? Investigators did not yet know. But they understood something crucial. The path toward solving the murders of James and Marie Prendergast almost certainly ran through him. And as detectives accelerated their efforts to locate the troubled drifter who had once been welcomed into the victim's home, the investigation prepared to enter its next stage. A stage filled with suspicion, conflicting interpretations, and a growing determination to uncover the truth behind one of the most shocking crimes the community had ever seen. The first days of a homicide investigation are often defined by momentum. Detectives move quickly. Witnesses are interviewed while memories remain fresh. Evidence is collected before it can disappear. Leads are pursued before they grow cold. Every hour matters. Every decision matters. The investigation into the murders of James and Marie Prendergast began with that same urgency, yet as detectives pushed deeper into the case, they encountered a challenge familiar to nearly every major criminal investigation. The closer they believed they were to the truth, the more complicated that truth became. From the beginning, Carl Alfred Eder appeared to occupy the center of the investigation. His connection to the victims was undeniable. His recent presence inside the household raised immediate questions. His increasingly troubling behavior provided a possible explanation for the escalating tension that had reportedly developed before the murders. To many observers, the case seemed almost solved before it had truly begun. But experienced investigators are wary of conclusions that arrive too easily. Criminal investigations are filled with assumptions that later collapse under scrutiny. The obvious suspect is not always the guilty one. The convincing theory is not always the correct theory. Detectives understood that their responsibility was not to prove a suspicion. Their responsibility was to discover the truth. And truth requires patience. The search for Carl Eder intensified. Officers distributed information. Witnesses were contacted. Individuals who had encountered him in recent weeks were questioned. Detectives attempted to reconstruct his movements before and after the murders. At the same time, investigators continued examining every aspect of the victims' lives. This dual approach is standard in homicide investigations. While one team focuses on a primary suspect, another examines alternative possibilities. Could someone else have had a motive? Was there a hidden conflict? A financial dispute? A personal grudge? Any possibility, no matter how unlikely, had to be considered. The public often imagines investigations as straightforward journeys from clue to clue. Reality is far messier. Information arrives in fragments. Witnesses contradict one another. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some leads appear promising before collapsing completely. Others seem insignificant before becoming critical. The Prendergast investigation followed this familiar pattern. In the days following the murders, detectives found themselves navigating a growing maze of information. Every conversation generated new questions. Every answer seemed connected to three more mysteries. Witness testimony became both valuable and frustrating. Human memory is imperfect. People rarely remember events exactly as they occurred. Fear, shock, and hindsight can alter perceptions. A witness who once considered a conversation unimportant may later assign tremendous significance to it. Another witness may unintentionally distort details while attempting to be helpful. Investigators must constantly separate memory from interpretation. This process became especially important as more people discussed Carl Eder. Some described him as troubled. Others described him as withdrawn. Some recalled behavior that seemed increasingly erratic. Yet none of these descriptions alone established guilt. Strange behavior is not evidence of murder. Detectives needed something stronger. They needed facts. They needed proof. They needed a chain of evidence capable of surviving scrutiny. Meanwhile, public speculation continued growing. Communities have a natural tendency to create narratives when information is incomplete. People fill gaps with assumptions. They combine facts with rumors. They construct explanations that feel emotionally satisfying. Unfortunately, emotionally satisfying explanations are not always accurate. In the Prendergast case, the existence of a known outsider made speculation especially intense. Eder's status as a drifter distinguished him from many members of the community. He was not deeply rooted in local relationships. He did not possess the same network of connections. To many observers, that difference made him easier to fear. Easier to blame. Detectives understood this dynamic. They also understood the danger it created. A successful prosecution requires more than suspicion. It requires evidence capable of withstanding challenges from defense attorneys, judges, and juries. Every conclusion had to be supported. Every claim had to be verified. As investigators continued their work, another question emerged. What exactly had motivated the murders? Motive does not always determine guilt, but it often provides valuable context. Understanding why a crime occurred can help explain how it occurred. In cases involving acquaintances, motives frequently revolve around conflict. Anger, rejection, resentment, humiliation, fear. The challenge was determining which, if any, of these forces had influenced events inside the Prendergast home. Reports suggesting that the family wanted Edda to leave naturally attracted attention. Detectives explored this possibility carefully. Rejection can be emotionally powerful, particularly for individuals already struggling with instability. A person who feels abandoned may interpret ordinary circumstances as personal attacks. A person experiencing psychological difficulties may perceive threats where none exist. Such possibilities did not excuse violence, but they could help explain it. The deeper investigators examined Edda's background, the more complicated the picture appeared. Cases involving severe violence often encourage people to imagine monsters. Reality is frequently less straightforward. Many offenders are neither entirely incomprehensible nor entirely understandable. They occupy an uncomfortable space between those extremes. Human enough to recognize, disturbing enough to fear. The available information suggested a man carrying significant personal difficulties. A man whose relationship with reality may not always have been stable. A man whose behavior increasingly concerned those around him. Yet even this emerging portrait failed to answer the most important question. Had he committed the murders? Detectives continued building their case piece by piece. Every witness statement was compared against physical evidence. Every timeline was tested. Every inconsistency was examined. Progress occurred gradually. Not through dramatic revelations. Through accumulation. Small facts reinforcing larger conclusions. The process resembled assembling a photograph from scattered fragments. At first, only isolated shapes appear. Eventually, a recognizable image begins to emerge. Yet even as the investigation advanced, uncertainty remained. Some leads pointed nowhere. Some theories collapsed under scrutiny. Certain possibilities initially considered important proved irrelevant. Such setbacks are normal. They are also emotionally exhausting. Investigators invest time, energy, and hope into leads that sometimes produce nothing. The public rarely sees this side of detective work. The long hours. The repetitive interviews. The endless paperwork. The frustration of pursuing information that ultimately changes nothing. In the Prendergast case, those frustrations became part of the journey toward justice. Because while detectives increasingly focused on Edda, they could not ignore alternative explanations until every reasonable possibility had been addressed. That discipline distinguished investigation from speculation. It prevented assumptions from becoming facts. It protected the integrity of the case. As days passed, however, the weight of evidence continued shifting in one direction. The connection between suspect and victims remained strong. The circumstances surrounding the relationship remained troubling. The timeline increasingly appeared consistent with investigative theories. Slowly, confidence grew. Not certainty. Confidence. There is a difference. Certainty belongs to fiction. Real investigations operate in probabilities and evidence. Detectives seek the explanation most strongly supported by facts. In this case, those facts increasingly pointed toward Carl Alfred Edda. Yet another challenge awaited. Even when investigators believe they know who committed a crime, proving it in court requires an entirely different standard. A suspect may appear guilty. A jury must be convinced beyond reasonable doubt. Every weakness in the case will be attacked. Every unanswered question will be highlighted. Every inconsistency will be magnified. Detectives knew that the investigation was moving toward that inevitable confrontation. The courtroom. The place where narratives collide. The place where evidence must stand on its own. Before that confrontation could occur, however, investigators needed a breakthrough strong enough to transform suspicion into a prosecutable case. They needed the piece that connected everything. The piece that would allow them to move from theory to action. Somewhere within witness testimony, forensic findings, behavioral evidence, and investigative reconstruction, that breakthrough was waiting. The question was how long it would take to find it. As the community watched anxiously, detectives continued their work. Every interview, every report, every lead, every late night spent reviewing details. They were approaching something. The outline of the truth was becoming visible. The maze that had seemed endless during the first days of the investigation was beginning to narrow. And soon, a development would emerge that changed the trajectory of the entire case. A development that transformed uncertainty into momentum. A development that brought investigators closer than ever to identifying exactly what happened inside the Prendergast home and who would ultimately be held responsible for it. The investigation had reached a turning point. The breakthrough was coming. Every major investigation contains a moment when scattered fragments suddenly begin fitting together. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough to reveal the outline of a larger truth. For the detectives working the Prendergast case, that moment did not arrive with dramatic certainty. There was no single piece of evidence falling from the sky. No witness running into a police station with all the answers. No cinematic revelation that instantly solved every mystery. Instead, the breakthrough emerged the way real breakthroughs often do. Gradually. Patiently. One detail reinforcing another. One fact supporting the next. Until eventually the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. By this stage of the investigation, Carl Alfred Eder remained the central figure in nearly every major lead. His connection to the victims had been established. His presence in their lives was no longer a question. What investigators needed now was a clearer understanding of his actions and movements during the period surrounding the murders. Detectives revisited interviews. Witnesses were questioned again. Timelines were refined. Small discrepancies that once seemed unimportant became subjects of intense scrutiny. In homicide investigations, details matter. Sometimes a case turns on a difference of minutes. Sometimes on a conversation remembered weeks later. Sometimes on a seemingly insignificant observation that only gains importance when viewed alongside other evidence. The Prendergast investigation was entering exactly that phase. Investigators began comparing statements from multiple sources. Patterns emerged. Certain accounts aligned in ways that strengthened existing theories. Other accounts helped eliminate alternative possibilities. Slowly, the fog surrounding the case started to clear. The image that emerged was deeply troubling. It suggested escalating tension between Eder and the family who had once offered him shelter. What initially appeared to be an act of generosity had evolved into a strained relationship marked by discomfort and concern. Detectives became increasingly convinced that the deterioration of that relationship represented the key to understanding the murders. Motive alone would never secure a conviction. But motive provides context. It transforms violence from a random act into a comprehensible event. As investigators assembled the timeline, they saw growing indications that Eder's future within the household had become uncertain. The possibility that he would need to leave appeared increasingly significant. To most people, such a situation would be disappointing but manageable. To someone experiencing emotional instability, the same situation could be interpreted very differently. Detectives could not know exactly what thoughts occupied Eder's mind. They could, however, examine behavior. And behavior was beginning to tell a story. Another important development occurred as authorities focused more intensely on locating him. The search generated new information. People who might not have realized the significance of their encounters suddenly came forward. Memories resurfaced. Observations once dismissed as ordinary acquired new meaning. Each contribution added another layer to the investigative picture. This process is one of the most fascinating aspects of major criminal investigations. A community becomes part of the search for truth. Hundreds of people unknowingly hold pieces of information. Most pieces are tiny. Alone they mean little. Together they can solve a crime. In the Prendergast case, those pieces increasingly pointed in one direction. Detectives now faced a critical decision. At what point does suspicion become sufficient for action? Move too quickly and risk mistakes. Move too slowly and risk losing opportunities. Every experienced investigator understands this balance. It is among the most difficult judgments in law enforcement. The evidence did not exist in isolation. Physical findings from the scene were being evaluated alongside witness statements and behavioral observations. The separate streams of information appeared to converge. Each reinforced the same emerging conclusion. Carl Alfred Eder was no longer merely a person of interest. He was becoming the focus of the entire investigation. As authorities closed in, another challenge emerged. Cases involving potential mental instability often become more complicated. Investigators must determine not only what happened but also whether the suspect's mental state influenced behavior before, during, or after the crime. Such questions carry enormous legal significance. They can shape charging decisions, courtroom strategies, sentencing outcomes, public perception. Even before the case reached trial, discussions surrounding Eder's psychological condition were beginning to surface. Some individuals who had encountered him described behavior they found unsettling. Others recalled moments suggesting detachment or emotional instability. None of these observations excused the murders, but they hinted at a deeper complexity beneath the surface of the case. Detectives remained focused on facts. Emotional theories could not replace evidence. Yet understanding the suspect's mindset helped investigators anticipate his actions. If he was fleeing, where might he go? If he felt cornered, how might he respond? Such questions became increasingly important as efforts to locate him intensified. The pressure surrounding the case continued growing. Newspapers followed developments closely. Residents wanted reassurance. Families wanted justice. Rumors spread through conversations at restaurants, workplaces, and neighborhood gatherings. In many ways, the investigation had become larger than the crime itself. It now represented a community's attempt to restore order after an act of profound violence. People needed answers. They needed to believe that chaos could be understood, that evil could be identified, that justice remained possible. Detectives carried that responsibility every day. Long hours became longer. Reports accumulated. Evidence boards filled with notes, photographs, and timelines. Investigative teams debated theories, re-examined assumptions, challenged one another's conclusions. This process may appear inefficient from the outside. In reality, it protects investigations from tunnel vision. The best detectives constantly question their own beliefs. They search for flaws in their theories before defense attorneys have the chance to do so. The Prendergast case demanded exactly that level of scrutiny. Yet despite repeated challenges and reviews, the overall direction remained unchanged. The evidence continued pointing toward Eder. Eventually the search produced the result investigators had been pursuing. Authorities located him. The moment marked a significant turning point. For days, uncertainty had dominated the investigation. Now detectives had an opportunity to confront the individual whose name had appeared repeatedly throughout their inquiry. Locating a suspect is not the same as proving guilt. But it changes the landscape dramatically. Questions can be asked directly. Statements can be evaluated. Reactions can be observed. New evidence can emerge. The gap between theory and proof begins narrowing. For investigators, this development represented the breakthrough they had been working toward since the first hours of the case. The person at the center of their investigation was no longer an abstraction. He was real, accessible, subject to examination. What followed would shape the remainder of the case. Every homicide investigation eventually reaches a stage where evidence and law intersect. Facts gathered in the field must survive legal scrutiny. Narratives constructed by detectives must withstand challenge. The Prendergast investigation was approaching that threshold. Authorities now possessed a suspect whose relationship to the victims, behavioral history, and surrounding circumstances placed him squarely in the spotlight. The next step involved transforming investigative conclusions into prosecutable facts. That process would not be simple. Questions regarding mental health remained unresolved. Questions regarding motive continued generating debate. Questions regarding intent would become increasingly important. Yet despite these uncertainties, investigators felt something they had not possessed during the earliest days of the case. Direction. Momentum. Confidence. Not confidence that every mystery had been solved. Not confidence that every answer had been found. But confidence that they were moving toward the truth. The murders of James and Marie Prendergast had shattered a family and stunned a community. Now the search for accountability was entering its most consequential phase. Detectives had followed the evidence through confusion, speculation, and uncertainty. They had assembled a case piece by piece. They had identified the individual they believed responsible. The breakthrough had arrived. What remained was the battle that follows many major investigations. A battle fought not at crime scenes or interview rooms, but inside courtrooms. A battle over responsibility, intent, sanity, justice. And the outcome would determine how history ultimately remembered Carl Alfred Eder. When a homicide investigation leaves the streets and enters a courtroom, the nature of the battle changes. Detectives search for facts. Prosecutors construct arguments. Defense attorneys challenge assumptions. Jurors are asked to navigate uncertainty and arrive at a conclusion that will alter the course of a human life forever. The courtroom becomes a place where competing versions of reality collide. And in the case of James and Marie Prendergast, that collision carried enormous weight. By the time legal proceedings began, the murders had already shaken the community. The names of the victims were familiar. The allegations against Carl Alfred Eder were known. Public attention had grown steadily throughout the investigation. People wanted answers. But courtrooms do not operate on public emotion. They operate on evidence. What matters is not what people believe. What matters is what can be proven. As prosecutors prepared their case, they faced a difficult challenge. The violence itself was horrifying. That much was clear. The investigation had produced a narrative that connected Eder to the victims and placed him at the center of events surrounding their deaths. Yet homicide trials are rarely simple. Every element of the prosecution's case must withstand scrutiny. Every conclusion must be defended. Every weakness becomes a target. The defense team understood this. Their responsibility was not to prove innocence. Their responsibility was to create reasonable doubt. And in this particular case, they possessed a potentially powerful avenue of argument. Carl Alfred Eder's mental state. Questions regarding psychological instability had followed the case from an early stage. Witnesses had described troubling behavior. Investigators had noted signs suggesting emotional disturbance. Conversations surrounding the suspect frequently returned to the same issue. What was happening inside his mind? That question now moved from the background of the investigation to the center of the courtroom. The distinction carried enormous legal significance. Courts often treat mental illness and criminal responsibility as separate but related concepts. A person may suffer from serious psychological difficulties while still remaining legally responsible for criminal actions. Determining where that boundary exists can become one of the most difficult tasks within the justice system. The courtroom became a forum for that debate. Prosecutors focused on accountability. They presented evidence intended to demonstrate deliberate actions and responsibility for the murders. Their argument emphasized behavior, decisions, sequences of events, the chain of circumstances that had culminated in violence. The defense approached the case differently. They explored questions surrounding Eda's mental condition. They examined whether psychological instability had influenced his perceptions, judgment, or understanding of reality. Such arguments did not erase the deaths of James and Marie, nor did they diminish the suffering caused by the crime. Instead, they forced the legal system to confront a difficult question. How should society judge an individual whose mind may not have been functioning normally? This question has challenged courts for centuries. There are rarely simple answers. Public opinion often favors certainty. Legal reality rarely provides it. Throughout the proceedings, the victims remained at the emotional center of the case. Their absence was impossible to ignore. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every argument presented in court ultimately traced back to the same reality. 2 lives had been taken. A family had been shattered. A community had been transformed. Courtroom debates about psychology and responsibility did not change those facts. For relatives and those who knew the Prendergasts, the proceedings carried a different meaning altogether. Legal terminology may seem abstract. Personal loss is not. Every day inside the courtroom represented another reminder of what had been taken from them. Another reminder that the people they loved would never return. Another reminder that justice, no matter the outcome, could never fully repair the damage. This emotional tension often defines homicide trials. The legal process seeks resolution. Grief rarely follows the same timeline. As testimony continued, jurors found themselves navigating competing interpretations of the same events. On one side stood arguments emphasizing responsibility and evidence. On the other stood arguments emphasizing psychological complexity and diminished capacity. Such cases rarely fit neatly into categories of pure evil or complete innocence. Human beings are more complicated than that. The justice system is often forced to operate within those complications. Observers in the courtroom likely studied Eda carefully. Criminal trials create a strange environment. The accused sits only a short distance away from the people evaluating his fate. Every expression becomes significant. Every gesture invites interpretation. Every moment of silence acquires meaning. Yet appearances can be deceptive. A calm face may conceal panic. An emotionless expression may conceal confusion. Human beings are notoriously poor at accurately interpreting internal experiences from external appearances alone. The courtroom drama surrounding Eda reflected this reality. Different observers likely saw different things. Some may have seen a dangerous killer. Others may have seen a deeply troubled man. Still others may have seen both simultaneously. That ambiguity contributed to the enduring fascination surrounding the case. It refused to provide easy answers. Eventually, however, the legal process moved toward its conclusion. Arguments were presented. Evidence was reviewed. Jurors faced the responsibility entrusted to them. Their decision would determine not only the outcome of the trial but also the next chapter of the story. Deliberations represent one of the most mysterious phases of any criminal case. Once jurors enter that room, public attention disappears. The debates occur behind closed doors. Perspectives clash. Evidence is reconsidered. Doubts are raised. Conclusions are challenged. The outside world waits. And eventually a verdict emerges. In the Prendergast case, that verdict carried consequences extending far beyond the courtroom itself. The legal system concluded that Carl Alfred Eda bore responsibility for the murders. The judgment marked a significant moment. Investigators had achieved what they set out to accomplish. The case had progressed from crime scene to conviction. A formal answer had been provided regarding who committed the murders. For many cases, that would have been the end. The killer identified. The trial completed. The sentence imposed. Justice served. Yet this story would refuse to follow such a straightforward path. Even as the courtroom chapter concluded, another chapter was quietly beginning. A chapter that would eventually transform the case from a tragic homicide into a lasting mystery. Eda entered the correctional system. The expectation seemed simple. He would remain there. Society had reached its verdict. The legal process had spoken. The danger appeared contained. Communities often find comfort in this stage of a criminal case. The belief that order has been restored. That accountability has been achieved. That the story is over. But stories rarely obey human expectations. Time passed. The headlines faded. Public attention shifted toward other events. New crimes appeared. New investigations began. The world continued moving forward. Yet beneath the surface, the case remained unfinished. Because while the courtroom had answered one question, it had not answered all of them. The legal proceedings established responsibility. They did not fully resolve the mystery surrounding Eda himself. The debates about mental health persisted. The questions about motive lingered. And perhaps most importantly, nobody yet understood that the future would bring developments far more astonishing than anything that had occurred inside the courtroom. The conviction appeared final. The sentence appeared definitive. The justice system seemed to have reached its conclusion. Looking back, however, we can see that the courtroom was not the ending. It was merely an intermission. The true mystery of Carl Alfred Eda had not yet begun. Years later, when researchers revisited the case, many would discover that the murders represented only the first act of a larger and stranger story. A story involving confinement, escape, disappearance, and a question that remains unanswered even decades later. What happened to the man convicted of killing James and Marie Prendergast? The courtroom had provided judgment. It had not provided permanence. And the events that followed would ensure that this case remained alive in public memory long after the trial itself had faded into history. Justice had been delivered. Or so it seemed. The years ahead would challenge that assumption in ways nobody inside the courtroom could have anticipated. When a criminal case reaches its legal conclusion, people often assume the story has ended. The verdict is delivered. The sentence is imposed. The courtroom empties. And life, slowly but steadily, moves forward. For the community connected to James and Marie Prendergast, that illusion of closure initially took hold. The investigation had identified a suspect. The trial had examined responsibility. The justice system had issued its decision. On paper, the case was resolved. Yet human stories rarely end where official records stop. Time continued passing, and with it came a gradual fading of public attention. New events replaced old headlines. New concerns filled newspapers. The Prendergast case, once a subject of intense focus, began to settle into the background of collective memory. But within that fading silence, something unusual began to emerge. Questions that had never fully disappeared started resurfacing. Not immediately. Not loudly. But slowly, through fragments of discussion and scattered references. Because the story of Carl Alfred Eda did not end neatly with his conviction. It continued into uncertainty. At some point after the trial and sentencing, reports began circulating that Eda was no longer accounted for in the way people expected. Details remained inconsistent, shaped by time and incomplete records. Some accounts suggested a disappearance from institutional oversight. Others implied a death that was never clearly documented in public memory. Still others pointed toward the possibility of an escape followed by complete loss of trace. None of these explanations were ever universally confirmed in a way that settled the matter definitively in public understanding. And that ambiguity became the defining feature of the case's final chapter. For investigators, correctional officials, and later researchers, the question was not only what Edda had done in the past, but where he had gone afterward. A convicted murderer is expected to remain within the boundaries of the system that holds him. When that expectation is broken, even partially, it creates an entirely new category of mystery. The Prendergast case, once defined by violent crime, became something else entirely. It became a question of disappearance. The human mind is naturally unsettled by unresolved endings. We are built to seek closure, to complete narratives, to place events into understandable sequences. But some stories resist that instinct. This was one of them. The murders themselves had already created a rupture in the lives of those directly affected. But the uncertainty that followed extended the emotional impact far beyond the original crime. Because now there were two layers of absence. The first was the loss of James and Marie. Permanent. Irreversible. The second was the absence of certainty about the man held responsible. Was he still alive? Had he escaped? Had he died without notice? Had he assumed another identity somewhere beyond reach? Each possibility carried its own unsettling implications. And none of them could be confirmed with absolute confidence in the public narrative that developed over time. This is why the case endured in true crime discussions long after many similar cases faded. Not because of the initial brutality alone, but because of what came after. The collapse of narrative certainty. The breakdown of expected closure. The possibility that a person once convicted of a double homicide may have slipped beyond the boundaries of historical record. As years turned into decades, the Prendergast case transformed into something larger than a single investigation. It became a reflection of how fragile our understanding of justice can be when records fade and systems change. It also became a reminder that conviction is not always the final word in how a story is remembered. Memory is shaped by documentation. But it is also shaped by silence. And in this case, silence carried its own weight. For the families of James and Marie, no legal outcome could restore what was lost. No verdict could return what had been taken. No sentence could rewrite the past. The emotional reality of the crime remained unchanged regardless of what happened to the perpetrator afterward. Grief does not recognize procedural completion. It exists outside courtrooms, outside sentences, outside official closure. At the same time, the unresolved question surrounding Edda created a different kind of discomfort for those who later encountered the case. Researchers, writers, and enthusiasts of historical crime found themselves drawn to the uncertainty. Because unanswered questions invite exploration. And this case offered several. What exactly happened after his conviction? Whether institutional records fully accounted for his later status? Whether rumors of disappearance reflected fact, confusion, or myth shaped by time? Each generation that revisited the story added another layer of interpretation. And with each layer, certainty became more elusive. This is the nature of long-forgotten criminal cases. They evolve. Not in evidence, but in narrative. Facts remain fixed, but interpretation shifts. Details are rediscovered. Others are lost. And what remains is often a blend of record and reconstruction. The Prendergast case, when viewed in this light, is not only about a violent act in the 1950s. It is about the way stories survive beyond their original context. It is about how justice systems intersect with memory. And it is about how disappearance, whether literal or informational, reshapes the meaning of accountability. James and Marie remain the most certain part of the story. Their lives. Their presence. Their loss. Those facts are not in question within the narrative that has survived. Everything else is layered around that certainty like shifting sediment. The investigation, the trial, the conviction, and the later uncertainty surrounding Edda all form the unstable perimeter of a core truth. 2 people were killed in their home after extending trust to someone they believed they were helping. That truth does not change. What changes is how the world remembers the person responsible. Whether he remained within the system. Whether he disappeared from it. Whether he lived or died in obscurity. Those uncertainties ensure that the case does not settle into simple conclusion. Instead, it lingers. Not as a solved story, but as an unresolved echo. And perhaps that is why it continues to appear in discussions decades later. Not because every detail is known, but because some of the most important ones are not. In the end, the Prendergast case leaves behind two different kinds of endings. One is legal, a point at which the justice system declared its judgment. The other is narrative, a point that never fully arrives because questions continue to survive beyond documentation. Between those two endings lies the space where this story continues to exist. A space shaped by memory, uncertainty, and time. A space where James and Marie remain fixed in history. And where Carl Alfred Eder remains, in many ways, a question without a final answer. And it is within that unanswered space that the case continues to live. Every true crime story eventually reaches a moment where facts end and reflection begins. Not because the story is solved, but because the human mind needs to step back from the weight of what it has been following. The case of James and Marie Prendergast is one of those stories that refuses to settle into a simple shape. It begins with trust. It moves through violence. It passes through investigation and judgment. And it ends, or appears to end, in uncertainty. When we look back at it, stripped of timelines and procedural language, what remains is something far more human. A decision to help a stranger. A family trying to do what they believed was right. A life interrupted inside a place that was supposed to be safe. These are not abstract elements of a case file. They are moments that could exist in any community, in any era, in any home where kindness still matters. That is what makes this story difficult to leave behind. It does not rely on extraordinary circumstances. It relies on ordinary ones. Ordinary people. Ordinary choices. And an outcome that no one could have anticipated. As the years passed, the Prendergast name became associated not only with tragedy, but with a broader reflection on vulnerability. The idea that safety is not guaranteed simply because a place feels familiar. The realization that trust, while essential to human connection, carries inherent risk. These are uncomfortable truths, but they are part of the reality that cases like this expose. At the center of it all remain James and Marie. Their lives are not defined by the crime that ended them, even though history often remembers them through that lens. They were people before they were victims. People who built a home. People who shared routines, conversations, and plans for the future. People whose absence left a gap that could never be filled. It is important to return to that reality because true crime narratives often drift toward focusing exclusively on perpetrators, investigations, and outcomes. But the foundation of every case is loss. And loss has a human shape. The other figure in this story, Carl Alfred Eder, occupies a different kind of space in historical memory. Not because of who he was in life alone, but because of the uncertainty surrounding what followed. Depending on which fragment of information one encounters, he is either a convicted man whose fate became obscured over time, or a figure who slipped beyond the boundaries of clear historical record. That ambiguity is part of what keeps the case alive in discussion. But it is not the most important part of the story. The most important part remains unchanged regardless of what happened afterward. Two people were killed in their home after extending trust to someone they believed they were helping. That fact stands independent of all later uncertainty. Investigations can close. Trials can conclude. Records can fade. But the reality of that loss does not change. As listeners, readers, or researchers revisiting this case, there is a responsibility that comes with engagement. It is easy to become absorbed in mystery. Easy to focus on unanswered questions. Easy to turn the unknown into the centerpiece of discussion. But behind every unresolved detail are real human consequences. Families who remember. Communities that were shaken. Lives that stopped continuing while everything else moved forward. This is why cases like the Prendergast murders remain important even decades later. Not because they offer entertainment, but because they force reflection. They challenge assumptions about safety, about trust, about the boundaries between kindness and risk. They remind us that violence rarely announces itself in advance. It often enters through ordinary doors, wearing ordinary faces, asking for ordinary help. And that reality is difficult to ignore once it has been seen. In the end, there may never be a single definitive emotional resolution to this case. The legal system provided its answer within its own framework. History provided fragments of continuation and uncertainty. Memory preserved the victims more than the details. And time softened the edges without removing the core impact. What remains is a story that continues to echo because it is not fully contained. It spills beyond its own boundaries into questions about human behavior and human vulnerability. It asks what we would do in similar circumstances. It asks what we would have noticed. It asks whether tragedy can ever truly be anticipated in advance. And it does not offer comforting answers. Instead, it leaves us with awareness. Awareness that ordinary moments can carry hidden weight. Awareness that trust is both necessary and fragile. Awareness that the line between safety and danger is often invisible until it has already been crossed. James and Marie Prendergast remain at the center of that awareness. Not as symbols. Not as statistics. But as individuals whose lives mattered beyond the moment they were taken. Their story ends in loss, but it continues in memory. And in that memory lies the only form of permanence the case can still offer. The investigation, the trial, and the uncertainty surrounding what followed all orbit that central truth. 2 lives were taken. A family was changed forever. And a community was left with a question that history has never fully resolved. That question continues to linger, not because it needs to be answered to understand the crime, but because it reminds us how incomplete justice can feel when viewed through the lens of human experience. In reflecting on this case, we are ultimately reflecting on something larger than a single event. We are reflecting on the fragile structure of trust that holds everyday life together. And on how quickly that structure can collapse when it is broken from within. That is the quiet weight of the Prendergast case. It does not shout. It does not conclude cleanly. It simply remains. And in remaining, it continues to ask us to remember what was lost, and to recognize how easily ordinary life can be disrupted in ways no one is prepared for. That recognition is where the story ends. And where its meaning continues.